Hi guys, Alex here from Nuggets News, and today I just want to talk off the cuff about whether or not we're heading into another global financial crisis, economic collapse, and all those doomsday scenarios that we hear about. I want to paint a bullish case, a bearish case, and explore a lot of these truths that I don't think are spoken about enough. So it's been 10 years since the GFC, and a lot of stock markets are coming off their highs. Housing has started to turn down in a lot of countries, and economies are really stalling at a time when they should be accelerating if governments around the world are planning on raising interest rates and getting rid of all this money printing that they injected into the economy to get them going. So in developed countries, most of these are now heavily indebted, and there's different types of debt. I'll talk about that as well, but there's three, sectors that are relevant here, and that's government debt, household debt, and business debt. Now, in the business sector, we're starting to hear about these zombie companies. They've issued junk bonds, and that money is just never going to be paid back. They can't even afford to pay their interest on the debt for that money they've borrowed, let alone the principal as well. Now, in terms of households, we see a lot of households like in Australia that have spent a lot of money. They've borrowed from the future in the hope to pay it down, with interest rates at record lows. And for governments, we're hearing these talks about austerity and governments should spend more to spur the economy, or governments are putting us too far in debt, 21 trillion in debt in the US. So there's those three different sectors that are, depending on different countries, all near or at record levels. So what has happened over the past 10 years since the global financial crisis is interest rates have been dropped to low levels to encourage people not to save money and not keep it in a bank. They want people to go out there and spend, and the central banks want banks to lend that money out to try and spur innovation and fund new businesses and so on. And that's the other reason that they've printed a lot of money to inject capital into these banks to make them safer for the bad debts they had. Just like in cryptocurrency, we talk about, a margin trade. You've got to have that margin in your account when things go sour, and the banks have had to be recapitalized with a lot of that quantitative easing, that money printing. But rather than invest in startups and innovation and so on, there's a lot of this money that's just gone into non-productive things. So, this can be seen as bad debt rather than good productive debt. Things like share buybacks, government programs that aren't really spurring innovation. Over taxation is another one that's really been in the headlines lately. Negative gearing in Australia. There's all these incentives to speculate rather than to invest in our future. And I'm going to talk about that political incentive for those short-term views as well. So the tax rate is one that a lot of people are up in arms about at the moment. This two-party system that nothing ever changes, nothing really gets done. And we're starting to see the rise of more radical or left or right political movements. So we've seen things like Brexit. Who would have thought Trump would be elected? And these yellow vests protests, and people just want change. People are fed up that the system's not really working for them, and inequality has never been higher in a lot of countries, and so on. So people are demanding change. Now, this comes at a time when I think we've lived through the best period of history of economic growth. That boom that we had in China particularly benefited Australia, but it really benefited the whole world, as we had, I think the stat is China used more concrete in a few years than there was used in 100 years in the US. So a really crazy amount, with millions of people becoming out of poverty and into the middle class. Now, this has happened to some degree in India as well, but really the benefit of all that cheap labour meant that we got to live a higher standard of living, and goods were produced cheaply, and all these countries around the world that are printing fiat money that's no longer backed by gold or anything, and these poorer countries that are developing are giving out all their goods and services to these countries that have printed money out of thin air. And I think that is all changing. There's a lot of strains on those dynamics, those relationships between Russia and China and a lot of these superpowers now, because they're sort of saying, hey, we're giving you all our resources, but you're just printing money. We don't really know how much is coming from productivity versus just banks printing this out of thin air, and central banks and so on. So at some point, all this debt needs to be paid back, whether it's government debt, household debt, or these business debt that often default. And as we saw, when businesses go belly up, it can cause that global financial crisis when people can't pay their mortgages and they start to default. So all those defaults are what people are worried about now. And with interest rates at record lows, they're only starting to rise a couple of percent, and only really in the US, and stock markets have already really corrected sharply. In Australia, we haven't even started to raise interest rates, and housing prices are correcting pretty sharply. So it's a worrisome picture for central banks that may have missed an entire business cycle. We may already be heading back into a downturn or recession, and they haven't raised interest rates, and they haven't really stopped money printing. So they might have to turn back on the printing presses, drop interest rates to zero or even negative, as they did in Europe already. So this is a pretty scary picture, and right now the world's trying to decide if central banks can get out of this corner that they appear to be backed into, or if everything's going to be okay. And I want to explore those different schools of thoughts as I said later. So in a lot of developing countries like Australia, they've become service economies where we serve each other coffee, or the avocado, smashed avocado, and the saying as it goes. But the manufacturing jobs, the retail jobs, the construction jobs, and even mining has really slowed down now that China and the rest of the world is sort of tapering off. And that's where a lot of high-paying jobs were. And that's why we're not seeing any wage growth. There's just lots of service sector jobs now. And a lot of the better jobs we've outsourced to other countries. A lot of the time they do the same thing at a far lower wage. And that's why we're not getting any wage growth. And people aren't just going to pay an architect $50 an hour in Australia if they can pay one $20 an hour over in Asia somewhere. Now we have internet and globalization and so on. That water level is going to meet in the middle somewhere, and that's probably not a great picture for countries like Australia that have had it so good for so long. So on top of that, all that speculation in these speculative assets in places like Australia, we've got a huge amount of loans that are about to be rolled over, where people have to refinance them and start paying the interest as well as the principal, or banks saying we can't just keep lending to all these investors. I think it was 60% of all mortgages were for investors at one stage in Sydney when things were going crazy. Now, a lot of these people are being told that they can't actually afford the mortgages or the apartments they went to board, especially if interest rates go higher. And I think the stat is that a $600,000 mortgage, if interest rates, without even going up, if they just have to start to pay the principal and the interest, it's an extra $800 a month for a household. Now, how many people have an extra $200 they can afford to come out of their wage every week, with so many people in debt, living paycheck to paycheck, and the data says what people are already digging into their savings. So in that situation, people have to bite the bullet and sell a lot of their goods. Maybe they sell that car. They can't afford to keep putting things on their credit card, or even have to downgrade their home to something more affordable. And there's already 1 million households estimated to be in mortgage stress in Australia. That's pretty crazy for a country of only 25 million people. There might be 10, 15 million households. There's 1 million that are already estimated to be in mortgage stress. So what can save us? And Australia's been the lucky country, and other countries do benefit from immigration of skilled workers. So if the population's growing, if there's good jobs and economies are growing, then that immigration can all justify. But at the moment, we're seeing people move away from Sydney where it's got too expensive. Australia is still a very attractive place to live for a number of reasons, but immigration doesn't still justify the inflation and the cost of houses and so on in these different cities, and we're just not getting that real wage growth. So what do you think? Do you think QE is going to come back to countries like Australia, or back to Europe and the US? Do you think rates are going to go lower? What do you think central banks are going to do? It's pretty crazy to think that we're 10 years out and we're still sort of having these conversations. So the story that I think is being told at the moment is normalisation. The central banks are saying everything will go back to normal. We'll go back to growing at 3% a year. Everything will be rosy. We'll pay down this debt. But we're hearing stories now, like a place like China that's been growing at 7%. We can't keep growing at that rate. Mathematics, the law of exponential numbers, at some stage it has to slow down. And there's rumours now that China's slowed to even 1%. Now, there's a number of other reasons why we can't just keep growing at the same pace we have. As I said, I think we've lived through the best period ever of history, where we had favourable demographics. All those baby boomers, the big wave of population growth that we had after the war, have all gone through that period where they spend lots of money. For the first time in history, we've got a really aging population. And there's a statistic that there's now more adult diapers in the world than baby diapers. We have so many aged people in care facilities and so on, and that's a pretty shocking stat that a lot of people can't get their heads around when I tell them that. The other thing is we're seeing a lot of people stressed, and things like the opiate addiction epidemic in America has actually got to the stage now where it's affecting their labour force and the workforce and the number of people without a job that have turned to drugs and so on. Now, I think this is at a stage where we've been so used to this good life, and you ask your parents or your grandparents that they had things really tough in terms of the food they could buy, the standard of the housing they lived, the jobs they worked, and the pay rate they got. Whereas our generation, it's, they want that big plasma, they want the good house, they want to go on a holiday every year. They want a good job. They don't want to have to travel too far. We're just so used to this good life and putting things on our credit card and going into debt. The thought of someone actually saving up until they can afford a TV, let alone their car or a house, that's just non-existent. People are so used to saying, no, just put it on debt, we'll pay it down later, we'll pay the interest on it as well. And people just aren't good at maths. They don't know how much money that they're paying in interest over time for these things versus if they could save and actually afford them. So we've borrowed a lot from the future, and it's time to pay the piper. We can't keep borrowing from the future forever, especially if we're not getting wage growth and improved standards of living and all these things that come along with it in different countries. So we live on a finite planet with finite resources. And yet the word sustainable or renewable, it's almost a bad word. People don't want to talk about how we can make things healthy and sustainable long term. People are obsessed with growth. How can we make more money? How can I get richer? How can I have more goods, a bigger home? How can we grow our economy versus actually having a sustainable one? And I think that is a theme that's going to change in the coming years, where renewable and sustainable are going to become good, healthy words, because you look at a country like Japan that's gone sideways for 30 years, where they've just desperately tried anything they can do to get growth. Sometimes it's not possible with demographics and depending on the maturity of your economy and your levels of debt and so on. Now, short-term malinvestment and politics has been one of the big driving factors in this. We know that people want to reward those things that are going to get them votes, and they're only thinking in their 2-year or 4-year election terms, and very few people are ever trying to do what's best for everyone in the longer term. And yet they like to paint this rosy picture that everything's going along really well. And as I tweeted about the other day, there's just no honesty in the system anymore. It's all BS. There's all, no, don't worry about that. That's just temporary. We're not allowed to use those negative words with negative connotations. And these people have never predicted a crisis because they're not honest. And now we see things like unemployment statistics are reported to be at record lows. But if you actually dive into the numbers and look at the number of people with a job, the active people in the workforce of working age and all that sort of thing, it's at record lows. So we just have this dynamic where they're telling us that things have never been better, when the reality is you could argue that things have never been worse. And the same with the way inflation is reported. Governments say that inflation's really low, the cost of living's not going up any faster than wage growth, and yet you talk to people that haven't had an increase in their wage in 10 or 15 years, and yet their basket of groceries has gone through the roof. The price of a house, that's been removed from the inflation calculation. So even though housing might have doubled or tripled and you haven't had a single increase in your wage, they say, no, it hasn't got more expensive to live. And we see things like, the bottle of cordial that gets downgraded in the size and it still counts as one bottle of cordial. Even if you're getting half as much for the same price, they say, no, that's not inflation. Or if your car has better airbags and better brakes, they say that even though it's double the price, you're getting twice as good a car. And so they're saying that cars aren't going up in price. So these inflation calculations is just another way that they pull these levers to try and make it look like everything's really great when it's not. So now I want to explore 3 different schools of thought about, can we get out of all of this unscathed, or are we heading into this big economic downturn, the biggest global financial crisis of all time, because each previous cycle has led to more debt and a bigger crash. So is the next one going to be the huge economic reset that a lot of people are calling for, and where we turn back to maybe some sort of sound money and so on. So I want to explore these three schools of thought. Now, the first one is probably the worst, the most bearish scenario. And this isn't coming across as derogatory, I hope, but it's where a lot of people, myself included, start the journey, where you're on YouTube and you're searching for global financial crisis and you're watching all these documentaries and researching, and the temptation is, once you go down the rabbit hole straight away, to think, geez, this is going to happen. I just read about it. This is going to happen. And there's YouTube channels out there that have been saying that silver's going to go to $600 and the economy's going to collapse next year, and they've been saying that for 10 years and it hasn't happened. So whether or not that is governments and money printing that has just kicked the can down the road, but I'm a believer that gold, silver, Bitcoin in some ways, anything that's an alternative to fiat money is going to be pretty attractive if we do have a downturn. But I'm not sure that doom and gloom Mad Max scenario is going to play out. Now, in this scenario, there's a huge reset. The banks all default, derivatives blow up, huge move away from the US dollar, and people move to those alternatives that I just spoke about, and they'd be skyrocketing in price in terms of US dollars at that stage. So I actually don't think that is likely to happen, and I want to talk about why as well. And that is the second scenario here, that the GFC was created by a lot of these credit default swaps and mortgage fraud, and in Australia now we've got a Royal Commission into those lending standards, but I don't think it's going to be that big this time around, and I don't think governments are going to let it happen. So we might have more governments bailing out these banks and printing more money, but I don't think they're going to ever let the economy go into that big of a downward spiral. And hey, there's ways to benefit of that scenario, and Bitcoin, gold, and silver, they all probably do well in this scenario where governments have to go full tilt on money printing, lower interest rates. But I just don't think they're going to let this huge recession or depression happen. They're going to try and pull these levers and work their way out of it, and maybe that leads to an even bigger crisis in another 10 years. Who knows? But look at countries like Japan that have been going sideways for 30 years with interest rates at record lows, buying up shares of the stock market, buying up government bonds, printing money, and they can't get any growth. And as I said before, I think the word sustainable, if you can even achieve that, that's going to be sort of the new win for a lot of economies. Just not going into recession will be good. Now, the final scenario is the bullish scenario, the positive one where everything works out okay. And again, I don't think that this is very likely that we're going to get just uninterrupted economic growth. And where's all that cheap labour going to come from that's no longer existent anymore? So I don't think people are going to borrow more. A lot of people are already too indebted. That debt's ever increasing. I don't think we're just going to get this healthy growth path because of the demographics. We know we've got a big aging population, as I just spoke about. So I'm very interested to hear your guys' thoughts below. What do you think about all this? Debt, interest rates, money printing, housing. How is your local economy going? Do you think Australia is actually one of the strongest economies and we are going to be saved by nice immigration, jobs, and wage growth? Has your local economy got good jobs, or have they become that service sector and they've lost all their manufacturing jobs? So I really want to get this discussion going. I think it's an important one to have, and I want to let you guys know that we are working on a documentary of sorts with some special guests where we want to really dive into the data and nitpick Australia to pieces with all that data about what's going to happen with the housing bubble and our immigration, all those statistics to paint a picture about what is most likely to happen in the future. So I hope you've enjoyed this off-the-cuff presentation, guys. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, share these videos around, and thanks for tuning in, guys. Cheers.